All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful ideas in all of psychology, Sigmund Freud's map of the mind. And what's so fascinating about this is that it isn't just some dusty, abstract theory. No, this is a map of your mind. You know that feeling, right? When you say something you absolutely did not mean to say, that classic Freudian slip? Or what about waking up from a dream that was so weird, so out there, you wouldn't even know where to begin to describe it? Yeah, I think we've all been there. Well, here's the thing. Sigmund Freud had this incredible idea that those moments, they're not just random brain glitches. He believed they were clues, important messages bubbling up to the surface from the deepest, most hidden parts of who you are. So to really get what Freud was talking about, we have to start with his most fundamental concept. The idea that our mind isn't just one big open space. Instead, it's divided up into these different hidden layers. And here's the first real bombshell from Freud. Get this, he split the mind into 3 levels. And the part we're actually aware of, our conscious mind, is just this tiny little sliver. The vast, vast majority is the unconscious. And that's really the core of his whole theory. It's like the classic iceberg metaphor, right? We only see the tiny tip sticking out of the water, while most of who we are operates completely below the surface. So let's dive into that biggest piece of the pie. Because for Freud, the unconscious isn't just some dusty attic where you store old memories. No. He saw it as the engine room, the powerful hidden motor that's driving nearly everything we think, feel, and do. So what is this thing, really? Well, it's basically the source of all our drives, urges, and instincts that we just don't have direct access to. And here's the kicker, the part that changed everything. Freud argued that even though we're not aware of it, this hidden world is what's actually pulling the strings, motivating most of our words, feelings, and actions. So what kind of stuff is lurking down there? Well, it's the raw, primal stuff. Our most basic drives and instincts. Things often related to aggression or sexuality. It's also like a mental holding cell for repressed memories. Experiences that were so painful or anxiety-inducing that our mind just shoved them down there to protect us. And then he even had this wild idea that it might contain inherited experiences from our ancestors. Now, you're probably thinking what I'm thinking. This all sounds fascinating, but if this whole thing is unconscious by definition, how on earth could anybody know it's even there? It's a perfectly logical question, and Freud had an answer. He basically said, you're right. You can't look at it directly. It's like trying to see the wind. You can't. But you can see the leaves moving. You can see its effects. So he studied the clues it left behind, the hidden symbols in our dreams, those revealing slips of the tongue, and even the way we conveniently forget things that are painful, a process he called repression. But these clues don't just wander out into the open. Oh no. According to Freud, there's a bouncer at the door of your conscious mind. He called it a censor. And its only job is to block thoughts that would make you anxious. So, for any of these hidden thoughts to get past the velvet rope, they have to be wearing a costume. They have to be in disguise. Here's a perfect example of how that works. Let's say a son has a deep, unconscious feeling of hostility toward his father. Now, that's a really threatening thought, right? The mind censor is going to block that for sure. So the unconscious gets clever. It flips the script and disguises the hostility as its exact opposite, over-the-top, exaggerated affection. And that disguise is what slips past the censor. So on the surface, all you see is a loving son, while the original true motive is totally hidden. Now let's circle back real quick to that idea about inherited experiences. Freud had a technical name for it, phylogenetic endowment. You might have heard of a similar idea from his student, Carl Jung, who called it the collective unconscious. They sound similar, but here's the crucial difference. For Jung, this was a massive, central pillar of his entire theory. For Freud, it was more of a last resort explanation, something he'd only use if he just couldn't explain a person's behavior based on their own life. Okay, so we've spent some time in the deep, dark basement of the mind. Now let's head upstairs to the 2 levels that are a lot easier to get into. First up is the preconscious. The best way to think of this is like a mental waiting room. It's where all the thoughts and memories are hanging out that you're not thinking about right now, but you could pretty easily. For example, the name of your best friend from high school. It was probably in your preconscious until I just made you think about it. And finally, we get to the conscious mind. This one's simple. It's whatever you're aware of, right here, right now. It's the only part of your mind you have direct access to. But, and this is a huge but in Freud's model, it's the smallest and, you could argue, the least significant part. It's just that tiny, visible tip of the iceberg. So how does stuff move between these areas? Well, that preconscious waiting room gets its thoughts from two main places. From stuff we were just consciously thinking about, and from those disguised ideas that manage to sneak up from the unconscious. Then, our conscious mind pulls ideas from that preconscious waiting room, and of course, it's also taking in brand new information from the outside world through our senses. Okay, so we've got all the pieces on the board, the conscious, the preconscious, and the huge, mysterious unconscious. Let's put this all together and talk about the big question. Why does any of this actually matter?
Freud himself gave us a fantastic analogy to help visualize the whole system. He asked us to picture the mind as a kind of house with a couple of different rooms and some very, very strict security guards. Let's walk through this house. First, you have the unconscious, which is like a massive, chaotic hall just teeming with unruly urges, all pushing to get out. But at the doorway stands the first guard, the primary sensor, blocking them. If a thought gets past him, it enters the preconscious, which is a much smaller, calmer reception room. But to be noticed by the eye of consciousness, it has to pass a second guard, the final sensor, who's watching from behind a screen. So in the end, the only ideas that get seen are the ones that are either harmless or are wearing a really good disguise.
So, what's the bottom line here? The crucial takeaway is this. Freud's theory suggests that the vast majority of what truly motivates you, your deepest wants, your fears, your drives, is completely hidden. It's a secret, even from yourself. And this whole system is managed by those two critical gatekeepers. Remember them from the house? The primary sensor between the unconscious and preconscious, and the final sensor guarding our actual awareness. They are working around the clock, disguising and blocking information, all to protect us from the anxiety that our own true urges would create if we saw them clearly. And that is why this model was an absolute game changer. For centuries, we believed humans were rational beings, that we were in the driver's seat of our own minds. Freud came along and said, that's pretty much an illusion. We aren't the masters of our own house. We are being driven by powerful, hidden forces we can barely even comprehend. And so that leaves us with a fascinating and maybe slightly unsettling final question to think about. If Freud was even partly right, what hidden forces, what disguised urges from deep inside your own mind might be shaping the choices you make every single day?
All right, let's dive into one of the biggest ideas in all of psychology, Sigmund Freud's model of our personality. We're going to see how our own mind can feel like a really tense committee meeting and why figuring out who's on that committee tells us a ton about who we are.
You know that feeling, right? One part of you absolutely needs that second piece of cake. Another part is shaming you for even thinking about it. And then there's this third voice, somewhere in the middle, trying to negotiate, like, okay, maybe just a tiny sliver. That internal tug of war? Yeah, that's what we're talking about today.
So a really great way to get a handle on this is to imagine an inner committee, a meeting that's going on inside your head, pretty much 24/7. The only problem? Every single member has a totally different personality and a completely different agenda.
And the person who put names to these inner voices was, of course, Sigmund Freud. So today, we're going to meet each member of this wild committee. You've got the primal, demanding id, the realistic, get-it-done ego, and the moral, judgmental superego. First up, let's meet the loudest one in the room.
Okay, first member of the committee. This is the most primitive, the most demanding one, the id. The absolute best way to think of the id, it's the impulsive toddler in the room that wants what it wants right now.
So according to Freud, the id is really the core of our personality, and it's buried way down deep in our unconscious. It has one single goal: satisfy our most basic urges for things like food, comfort, and sex to get rid of any tension. It runs completely on what Freud called the pleasure principle.
And its characteristics are, well, they're pretty wild. The id is pure chaos. It's totally illogical. It can want two opposite things at the same time. It's amoral, which means it has zero concept of right or wrong. It's completely disconnected from reality, and it only cares about one thing:
getting what it wants immediately. Freud himself gave us the perfect mental image for this. He said that a newborn baby is the id personified. I mean, think about it. An infant wants gratification, food, comfort, and has no idea about what's proper or even possible. It just wants, and it wants it now. That's the id in its purest form. Okay, so if we all start out as this bundle of pure, raw impulse, how do we ever learn to function in the real world? Well, that brings us to our second committee member, the ego, our very own reality manager. So as we grow up, the ego basically sprouts from the id. It's the part of our personality that actually has to deal with the outside world. You can think of it as the executive branch. Its main job is to take all those wild demands from the id and figure out how to satisfy them in a way that's, realistic and socially acceptable.
And right here you see the central conflict. The id, running on the pleasure principle, is screaming, "I want it now." But the ego, governed by the reality principle, has to step in and be the adult in the room, saying, "Whoa, hold on. Let's figure out a way to get that without, burning the house down." It's a non-stop negotiation. Freud had this brilliant analogy for it. He said the ego is like a rider on a horse. The horse is the id. It has all the power and energy. The rider, the ego, tries to guide it and keep it in check, but ultimately the horse is way stronger. And get this, the ego has no power of its own. All of its energy is borrowed directly from the id.
But just when you thought it was a simple two-way battle, this committee meeting gets a whole lot more complicated. We've met the impulsive child and the practical manager. Now, it's time to meet the final member, the superego, our tough inner judge.
The superego is basically our moral compass. It's all about our ideals, our sense of right and wrong, and it is always, always pushing for perfection. It starts to develop when we're around 5 or 6 as we soak up the rules and values from our parents and society. And just like the id, it has zero contact with reality, which means its demands for perfection are often completely unrealistic.
Now, the superego isn't just one thing. It actually has two parts. First, you have the conscience. This is built from all the times we were punished. It's that nagging voice that tells us what we should not do, and it's the part that makes us feel guilty. Then you have the ego ideal. This comes from rewards and praise. It tells us what we should be doing. It's our image of the perfect version of ourselves. And when we don't live up to it, that's what causes those feelings of inferiority.
So now everyone's at the table. You've got the impulsive id, the perfectionist superego, and the poor realistic ego stuck right in the middle. And let me tell you, this is not a friendly meeting. This is a constant, high-stakes negotiation.
I mean, you've got a feel for the ego here. It's stuck in this impossible position, constantly trying to serve 3 different and often totally brutal masters. And this 3-way battle, that is the source of so much of our internal conflict and anxiety.
Just think about the pressures it's facing. On one side, it's got the relentless, "I want it now" demands from the id. On the other side, it's got the rigid, moralistic, "you must be perfect" rules of the superego. And all of this is happening while it's also trying to deal with the actual constraints of the real world. The ego's job is to somehow make peace between all 3, which is an unbelievably difficult task.
And here's the big takeaway. Here's why all of this really matters. According to Freud's model, our entire personality, our psychological health, it's all determined by this delicate balancing act. It all comes down to how well our ego can manage this crazy internal negotiation. You can really see how this balance, or the lack of balance, shapes who we are. If someone's id is totally dominant, they might be really impulsive, always chasing the next good feeling and ignoring the consequences. If the superego is running the show, they might be totally weighed down by guilt and always feeling like they're not good enough. But a psychologically healthy person, that's someone with a strong ego, who can skillfully balance the id's desires with the superego's morals, all while keeping a firm grip on reality. Which brings us to the final question. For you, the next time you feel that internal pull, that tug of war, just listen for a second. Who's talking? Is it the demanding child, the harsh judge, or is it the pragmatic manager? Who is really in charge of your inner committee?
Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most famous, and maybe infamous, ideas in all of psychology, Sigmund Freud's theory of personality. We're going to try and unpack the hidden forces that, he believed, are the secret engine behind everything we think, feel, and do.
I mean, it's the ultimate question, right? Why do you want the things you want? Why do you sometimes get so angry or fall so deeply in love? We like to think we're in the driver's seat, making all these rational choices. But what if there's something else, something deeper and way more chaotic, pulling the strings?
For Freud, the answer was a hidden battle. He didn't see our personality as some stable, fixed thing. No, he saw it as this dynamic, churning battlefield. A constant internal tug of war between two fundamental forces, always pushing and pulling right under the surface of our awareness.
To really get what he was talking about, we have to go down into what you might call the engine room of the mind. This is where Freud believed all the raw power for our actions comes from. And he didn't just call them urges. He had a very specific word for them.
He called it Trieb, a German word that's best translated as a drive. And this is a really key point. See, a drive isn't like an outside temptation you can just ignore or walk away from. It's a constant internal pressure cooker. You can't escape it. It's a force inside you that demands to be satisfied.
Freud basically sorted all of these inescapable drives into two big competing teams. On one side, you've got Eros, the life drive. This is everything that pushes us to create, to connect, to seek pleasure, to live. The energy that fuels it, that's the famous libido. And on the other side, you have Thanatos, the death drive. This is the impulse toward aggression, destruction, and, believe it or not, a return to nothingness. So, life versus death, creation versus destruction, this is the main event.
All right, so let's take a closer look at these two power sources, one by one. First up, the one everybody's heard of, Eros, the engine of pleasure in life.
Now, I know what you're thinking. When people hear Freudian sex drive, their mind usually jumps to one thing. But for Freud, it was so much bigger than that. The real aim of Eros was simply pleasure, in all its forms. He believed our whole body is wired with this pleasure-seeking energy, this libido. So anything that brings you joy, from eating an amazing meal, to getting lost in a piece of music, to building a friendship, in Freud's world, you can trace that all back to Eros.
And you can see just how broad this idea is when you look at all the different ways he thought this libido could show up. When that energy is pointed back at yourself, he called it narcissism. When it's directed out at someone else, well, that's love. It can even get tangled up with our darker impulses to create things like sadism or masochism. It's kind of wild, but for Freud, these were all just different flavors of the same core drive for pleasure.
So, how do we get from that raw pleasure-seeking drive to the kind of non-sexual love we feel for our family? Freud had a theory for that too. He said, look, an infant's first love object is its caregiver. But as we grow up, society and our own internal rules force us to push down or repress the purely sexual side of that attachment. And what's left over is what he called aim-inhibited love. It's that deep affection for our parents and siblings, where the original aim of the drive has been blocked.
But Eros isn't running the show all by itself. Oh no. Fighting against it at every single turn is the second great power source of our psyche, Thanatos, the destructive drive.
And listen to how Freud himself puts it here, because it is seriously chilling. He says the ultimate goal of this drive is to return us to an inorganic state. I mean, think about that. The final aim isn't just to hurt or break things. It's self-destruction. It's a pull toward the quiet, simple state of non-existence, a drive toward death itself.
Now, that sounds incredibly dark and extreme, right? A death drive. But Freud said we see little echoes of it all around us, every day, in much more common ways. Every time you tease someone, or spread a little gossip, or use some really cutting sarcasm, or even when you just enjoy a dark joke at someone else's expense. For Freud, that's Thanatos, the aggressive drive. Just finding a little socially acceptable way to leak out.
And the implications of this idea are just huge. For Freud, Thanatos was the only thing that could really explain the massive scale of human cruelty. You know, wars, genocides, all the atrocities of history. He even argued that our highest moral laws, commands like love thy neighbor, they exist for a reason. They exist precisely because our natural, unconscious impulse is the exact opposite. They're the walls we have to build to hold our own destructive nature in check.
Okay, so you've got these two colossal drives,
Eros and Thanatos, locked in a permanent wrestling match. And on top of that, they're constantly crashing into the rules of the real world and our own conscience. So, what's the result of all this internal chaos? Well, it's a feeling we all know very well: anxiety. You can think of it as the mind's alarm system.
Freud was really specific here. Anxiety isn't the fight itself. It's the signal that a fight is happening. It's that awful, tense feeling produced by our ego. That's the conscious, rational, manager part of our mind that has to try and keep everything together. It's the alarm that blares whenever an unacceptable impulse from our primal drives threatens to break out into the open.
And he actually broke anxiety down into 3 different types, each one pointing to a different kind of conflict. First, there's neurotic anxiety. That's the fear that your primal instincts, your id, are about to get out of control and make you do something terrible. Then there's moral anxiety. That's the feeling of guilt or shame when you break or even just think about breaking the rules of your superego, your inner conscience. And finally, there's realistic anxiety, which is the most straightforward. That's the fear of actual, real dangers out in the world. They all feel pretty bad, but each one is a different alarm.
So here's the really crucial takeaway. Anxiety, as awful as it feels, actually serves a vital purpose. It's an ego-preserving mechanism. It's a fire alarm for your mind. It's the signal that warns the ego, hey, pay attention, you need to do something, now. Whether that's running away, fighting back, or, in the Freudian world, most often, pushing that threatening impulse back down into the unconscious, where you don't have to deal with it.
So all of this brings us to the grand finale of Freud's dynamic theory. And the key thing to realize is that this isn't a problem that you can solve. It's just a permanent state of being human. Life versus death. Pleasure versus destruction. Creation versus oblivion. According to Freud, this is the central lifelong conflict. It's not just a part of our lives, it is our lives. It's the engine that drives our passions, our fears, our love, and our hate, from the moment we're born until the moment we die.
Now look, Freud's ideas are controversial, to say the least, and a lot of them have been challenged over the years. But this central idea, that we are all driven by these powerful, often contradictory forces that we don't fully understand, that's a pretty sticky idea, isn't it? So the question I want to leave you with is this. When you look at yourself and when you look at the world around you, does this century-old idea of a hidden internal battle still feel like it has something true to say? Thanks for watching The Explainer.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that's, well, it's pretty wild. It's this piece of psychological history that's still super relevant today. We're talking about the secret strategies your own mind uses to protect you from, well, from yourself. So let me ask you something. Have you ever done something that, when you think back on it, just makes absolutely zero sense? You know, we've all been there. Those moments where you just look back and think, what was I thinking? Why on earth did I do that? Like, think about it.
Maybe you just completely snapped at someone over a super tiny mistake.
Or how about this one, being crazy, like fake nice to a person you secretly can't stand? Or maybe blaming somebody else for the exact feelings you're having? Yeah, whether it's lashing out, being way too nice, or pointing the finger, it turns out there's a reason for all of it. A single psychological system that's working deep inside your mind. Okay, so let's get into it. To understand these kind of strange behaviors, we need to go on a little journey inside the mind, to a fundamental conflict that Sigmund Freud figured out more than 100 years ago. So picture this. Inside your head, there's this constant tug of war happening. On one side, you've got the id. This is the totally unconscious, impulsive part of you. It just wants what it wants right now. No rules, no consequences. And on the other side, that's your ego. That's your conscious self, the manager, whose job is to deal with the real world and try to keep the id's, let's call them unacceptable demands, in check. And this battle, it's not a quiet one. It creates this really intense, super uncomfortable feeling that we all know, anxiety, right? It's like a warning siren going off in your head. The ego is freaking out, thinking it's about to lose control, that these raw, forbidden impulses from the id are going to break through. So your mind has to do something. It's got to protect itself. And that brings us right to the main event. To fight off that anxiety, the ego has this whole secret toolkit of mental tricks. Freud called them defense mechanisms. And look, we all use them, they're totally normal. So let's meet a few of the big ones. Okay, first up is repression. This is kind of the most basic one, the foundation for all the others. It's basically the ego's brute force move. It just takes a threatening thought or a painful memory and shoves it way, way down into your unconscious so you're not even aware of it anymore. Poof! It's not gone, of course, just hidden. So what happens when those feelings you repressed start trying to bubble back up to the surface? Well, that's where reaction formation comes in. This one's tricky. The ego doesn't just hide the feeling, it puts on a full performance of the exact opposite. Here's a classic example. Imagine someone whose love for their mother is just completely over the top. It's showy, it's exaggerated, it's relentless, you know? That crazy intensity is actually a huge clue. It's a mask, and it's hiding a really powerful, totally opposite feeling. In this case, unconscious hate, that the ego just can't handle. All right, next up, we have displacement. This one isn't about reversing the feeling, it's about re-aiming it. The ego takes an impulse that's pointed at a threatening person or thing and just shifts the target to something safer, something that won't fight back. I mean, think about it. You are furious at your boss, but you can't yell at them, right? You'd get fired. So instead, you go home and you yell at your roommate, or you snap at your cat, or you kick a chair. The anger is totally real, but you've displaced it onto a much safer target. Okay, projection is one of my favorites. It's so fascinating. This is when your ego takes a feeling or a trait that you have, but you can't accept in yourself, and it just paints it onto somebody else. It's like you're seeing your own unwanted stuff reflected back at you from the outside world. Freud thought that in really extreme cases, like paranoia, this follows a very specific, kind of twisted logic. First, an unacceptable feeling, like, I love him, gets flipped by reaction formation into, I hate him. But even that's too much anxiety for the ego, so it takes one more step. It projects it outward, turning I hate him into the much more comfortable, self-protective thought, he hates me. Okay, so sometimes when we're facing a really stressful situation, the ego doesn't just redirect feelings, it literally travels back in time. This is called regression. It's a retreat to an earlier, safer, more comfortable stage of your life. You know, like a kid who, after a new baby sister is born, suddenly starts wanting a bottle again, or an adult under huge stress who curls up in a ball in bed. So this whole toolkit, it's universal. We've established that. We all use these things to deal with anxiety. But what happens when we lean on them too much? When they become our only way of coping? Well, when these defenses get pushed to the extreme, they stop being a helpful shield and start becoming a cage. They lead to these really rigid, compulsive, kind of neurotic behaviors. And it takes a ton of mental energy to keep them up, energy that could be going toward growth or creativity or real connection. Ultimately, they keep us from actually dealing with our needs in a healthy, direct way. But wait, not all defense mechanisms are about just hiding or twisting things. Freud pointed out one that's actually really constructive, one that not only helps us, but can actually help society too. And that brings us to sublimation. This is the art of taking that raw, primal energy from the id, all those aggressive or sexual urges, and rechanneling it into something productive, something creative, something society actually values. Think about a surgeon channeling aggressive urges into the precise, life-saving skill of using a scalpel. Or an artist like Michelangelo, taking all that intense inner turmoil and transforming it into breathtaking art. It's really the most mature, the most constructive defense of them all. So here's the big takeaway. These mechanisms, they aren't personal flaws. They're your mind's universal survival guide, built to handle a pretty impossible internal conflict. The real question isn't if you use them, because you do, we all do. The question is how and how much. So I'll leave you with this to think about. If you really took a hard look at your own life, which of these tools would you find your ego reaching for the most?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping into one of the most famous and, let's be honest, controversial theories in all of psychology. We're talking about Sigmund Freud's blueprint for who you are. And here's the kicker. According to him, that whole plan was drawn up before you could even tie your own shoes.
So let me ask you something. What do you think really makes you, well, you? Is it your DNA? All the stuff you've been through? The choices you make every day?
It's a huge question, right? Something we all think about.
Well, Sigmund Freud had a pretty radical answer. He basically argued that the core of your adult personality, your quirks, your anxieties, what you're drawn to, was all set in stone in the first 5 years of your life, like a blueprint, locked in.
Okay, so to really get this blueprint, you have to understand one key idea, the erogenous zone. Now, for Freud, this wasn't just about sex in the way we think of it. It was any part of the body that becomes the main focus for our basic, pleasure-seeking drive, what he called the libido. And as we grow up, where we find that pleasure, it moves around the body.
And that shift happens across 5 stages. This is basically the roadmap for our whole explainer today. We're going to start in infancy with the oral stage, then move to the anal and phallic stages in those toddler and early childhood years. After that, things kind of cool off for a bit in the latency stage, before everything comes roaring back in the final genital stage.
All right, so let's start at the very beginning. Our journey begins where life begins, infancy. This is what Freud called the oral stage. And for a baby, everything, I mean everything, pleasure, comfort, connection, it all happens through the mouth.
So in the first part of the stage, the pleasure is, receptive. It's all about sucking, taking in milk. But then the teeth come in. And with them, something Freud called oral sadism, the pleasure of biting. Now, the big conflict here is weaning. And Freud's whole thing was, if this doesn't go smoothly, some of that oral energy gets fixated, kind of stuck. And that, he said, could pop up later in life as things like smoking, overeating, or even, biting sarcasm.
Next up, as a toddler starts to get control over their own body, the focus of that libido, well, it shifts downwards. So welcome to the anal stage, a time that's all about control, conflict, and the power struggle of toilet training.
And this stage really has 2 parts. At first, the pleasure is all about letting go, expulsion. But then society, in the form of parents, steps in with toilet training, and a new kind of pleasure shows up, retention, holding on, being in control. How this whole battle plays out is crucial. Freud believed that really strict or stressful training could lead to what we now call an anal retentive personality. That person who, as an adult, is super orderly, maybe a bit stingy, and definitely stubborn.
All right, let's move on to the next stage, which Freud thought was the most important and definitely the most complicated. We're talking about ages 3 to 5, when we hit the phallic stage. This is the point where the psychological paths for boys and girls take a sharp, dramatic turn away from each other for the first time.
And this big split, it's all rooted in one of Freud's most famous and, most controversial ideas. This quote says it all. Anatomy is destiny. He genuinely believed that the simple physical fact of being born male or female sets off 2 totally different psychological chain reactions.
And at the absolute center of this stage is a kind of universal family drama. Freud named it after an old Greek tragedy, the Oedipus complex. It's this whole story of desire, jealousy, and fear that he believed plays out inside every child's mind.
And you can see those 2 different paths right here. Both journeys kick off with the same basic discovery about anatomy, but look at how it creates 2 completely different motivations. For boys, it's fear. For girls, it's what Freud famously called penis envy. You can see how this one difference pushes them in totally opposite directions with their parents and leads to these very different resolutions that he thought would define their adult personalities.
So for boys, the engine driving this whole drama is castration anxiety. Now, we're not necessarily talking about a literal threat here. It's more of an unconscious, deep-seated, terrifying fear that his father will punish him for his feelings toward his mother. This intense fear is what finally breaks the Oedipus complex and forces the boy to start identifying with his father, with his power and his rules.
And for girls, the driving force, according to Freud, was what he called penis envy. He theorized that this feeling of anatomical lack causes a girl to reject her mother, who she blames, and turn her affection to her father. The unconscious wish for a baby, especially a son, then becomes a sort of substitute for what she feels she's missing.
Now, this led Freud to a conclusion that is, without a doubt, one of his most criticized ideas. He argued that because girls don't have that sudden, traumatic shock to resolve their complex, it just kind of fades away slowly. And the result, he claimed, was that women ended up with a weaker superego. That's your inner moral compass, your conscience. He basically said it was more flexible and less rigid than a man's.
Now, look, this was a hugely controversial claim even back then. And it's really important to add some context here. Freud himself admitted he was on shaky ground. In 1926, he famously wrote that the sexual life of adult women was a dark continent for psychology. He was basically confessing that even he didn't fully get it. So he saw this part of the theory as a work in progress.
Okay, so after all that intense psychological drama of the phallic stage, things finally quiet down for a bit. We're now heading into the last phases of development. Think of it as the calm before the final storm of adolescence. So first you get the latency period. This is from about age 5 all the way up to puberty. The sexual drive basically goes dormant, and all that psychic energy gets channeled or sublimated into things like school, making friends, and hobbies. Then, bam, puberty hits, and the genital period erupts. The libido wakes back up, but this time it's aimed outward, at other people, which lays the groundwork for adult relationships. All of this is supposed to lead toward an ideal of maturity, a perfect psychological balance that, honestly, Freud thought pretty much nobody ever really achieves.
So, after that whirlwind tour through childhood, what's the big takeaway here? What are we supposed to make of all this?
If you boil it all down, Freud's central argument is this. Those little unconscious dramas from our first 5 years, how we were weaned, how we were toilet trained, how we navigated that first messy family triangle, they create a permanent blueprint that shapes the person we become for the rest of our lives.
Now, look, so many parts of this theory, especially his ideas about women, have been debated, torn apart, and revised for over 100 years. That's for sure. But Freud's central question, it's still with us. It's just as powerful today. And it's one we can all ask ourselves. How much power does our childhood really hold over the person we are today?